Part II, Chapter 4 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The Fictitious Isidore. Every period of religious ferment exhibits a disposition to fortify the opinions of the present by an appeal to the past. The tendency applies to the evil as well as the good. During the first period of the Middle Ages, there prevailed in the whole of Latin Christendom a calm and subdued desire for papal elevation, which, notwithstanding the outward fraternity between emperor and pope, was preparing to assert itself whenever the right hour struck. The papacy had advantages over the imperial rule of a family. The son might be a poor and weak successor to his father, but no man could seat himself on the episcopal chair of Rome without at least some measure of ability. There was a division within the narrow rule of the ecclesiastical government. The metropolitan bishops were appointed by the emperor, but the bishops in general were supposed to be appointed by the pope. The classes were thus arrayed against each other. By a shrewd manipulation of public sentiment, the episcopal and papal interests received a strong support in a skilful forgery. A Spanish archbishop of the seventh century, Isidore of Hispalis, performed for the German Church the distinguished service of making it acquainted with a number of important classical and patristic works. He died in 636, and left behind a name of great repute for mental and moral endowments. His services and fame were used as authority for a forgery, in favor of Roman authority as against the political ruler. The entire Church was deceived, but it was a most welcome deception. The secret lay concealed long enough to fortify every branch of ecclesiastical authority, to make political rulers tremble, and to make Rome ready, when the Carolingians ran out, to extend her spiritual sceptre over all rulers. The pseudo-Isidorian decretals combined all the qualities of a perfect deception. They represented a class, and yet were the best of their order. A collection of canons and epistles of Dionysius Exiguus, for example, had been generally used in the West. Isidore of Hispalis had written a collection of important canons not found in that of Dionysius Exiguus, and by his work had contributed greatly to the centralization of ecclesiastical authority in Rome. How could this same work be carried further, now that the Carolingian Empire had gained such great prestige, and threatened to eclipse the Roman bishop, and had been implored to come and help him fight his battles against the Lombards? Isidore, now in his grave, was, therefore, used to build up this endangered cause. It was pretended that he had left behind a set of decretals, the doings of former councils, which had never seen the light. Now, thanks to good fortune, they had been discovered. They were soon scattered as widely as rapid copyists could multiply them. No compiler had dared to go back further than the authority of Siricius, whose pontificate extended from A.D. 384 to 398. But this forger was no timid character. He boldly rushed back to alleged decrees of unknown councils, and to letters claiming to be written by Clement and Anacletus, bishops of Rome contemporary with the apostles, and by nearly 30 of the apostolic fathers themselves. The contents of the forged work were enough to condemn it. It was divided into 3 parts. The first contained, in addition to the authentic 50 apostolical canons, 59 spurious decretal writings of Roman bishops from Clement I to Melchiades, or from the end of the 1st century to the beginning of the 4th. Even the reputed donation of territory by Constantine to the papacy, a thing which never took place, was brought in to help the common interest. The second part comprised only authentic synodal canons. The third presented some real decretals, but, besides these, there were 35 spurious ones, which were held to have been written at various times from Pope Sylvester I, who died in 335, to Gregory II., who died in 731. The one purpose pervading the entire work was to prove, by early authority, the independence of the bishop. The Church must protect herself and her priesthood. The bishop must be made independent of his metropolitan. When a bishop is tried, it must not be before a metropolitan or a secular tribunal, but before the pope alone. Even a clerk must be tried before an ecclesiastical court. An offense against a priest is an offense against God himself, for a priest is very dear to God, the very apple of his eye. No charge against a bishop can be declared sustained unless supported by 72 witnesses. The court must consist of 12 other bishops. Only the pope can convene provincial synods, and his approval is necessary for the efficiency of their decrees. The former opinion that the Decretals were intended to prop up the primacy of Rome is now abandoned by the majority of scholars. The opinion is at present divided between two views. The first is that the purpose of the publication was to form a general code of Christian discipline and government necessary at a time of general insecurity in society and of confusion in church affairs. The second, and perhaps the better view, is that the real meaning of the Decretals was to free the bishops from their dependence on the state and on their metropolitans and provincial synods. The authority of the pope was recognized and emphasized, but only for the sake of the bishop. The authorship of the Decretals has remained a secret. That Isidore never wrote the collection can be seen in the barbarous Latin of the 9th century, citations from works of late authorship, clumsy anachronisms throughout the collection, the absence of all testimony to the authority of the more ancient portions of the Decretals, and the attempts to meet contemporaneous prejudices. Never in the whole history of literature was a fabrication obscured by more doubt, or permitted to pass so long without challenge. The date of publication ranged between A.D. 844 and 857. It was probably written in the Frankish Empire of Rome, but the evidence is not decisive. The most plausible theory of authorship is that Archbishop Riculf, A.D. 786 to 814, brought the genuine Isidore from Spain, that this was enlarged and corrupted by the Archbishop Autear, and published at Mainz, and that the copying was done by the Benedictine monk Levita, who may have had no suspicion of the fraud he was perpetrating. The influence of the false Decretals was such that popes, councils, synods, and minor ecclesiastical officers appealed to them as final authority. They were brought out to decide questions which shook the Christian world. After the year 864, they were habitually used in papal rescripts as having binding force. Their genuineness was never questioned until the 12th century. The first doubts were raised by Peter Comestor. But the fraud was never proven until the 16th century, when the first Protestant church historians, the authors of the Magdeburg Centuries, exposed the successful trick. Since then, the better Roman Catholic historians have abandoned the Decretals as authentic, but hold them to be a pious fraud. Moeller calls their author a romanticist. Cardinal Newman, however, goes further, and with his characteristic candor calls the Decretals a forgery. End of chapter 4.